regional devolution has long been a lot of the goals for mainly a lot of the political parties, and even though the Tories have said that they support this idea in practice, in reality, they don't really want to do it because you then have to take a look at the regional voting bases for many of the Conservatives. And especially in places like Yorkshire, they wouldn't stand a ghost of a chance in trying to get a regional elected. So imagine the situation that we could be in now. Imagine that you had a regional Yorkshire, one Yorkshire Assembly, and they were pretty much all Labour. What would the situation be going on now? Ultimately, you would have had an even stronger, as just as Andy Burnham stood up for Manchester, you would have had the regional representatives stood up and stand up for Yorkshire. I do think, and I'm still a very, very strong believer in the idea of a one Yorkshire devolution settlement. And I do think that would help so much Yorkshire as a whole completely, because Yorkshire has really, really suffered, not just for the past 10 years, but for quite some time under essentially general Tory rule. And even though we had Labour rule for a long while, what the money we actually got from developing Yorkshire actually came from the EU. But, you know, that's another story for another time. But we have a very interesting situation brewing at the moment, where I think you are going to see a push from this probably even more. Certainly not the Conservatives, because the Conservatives just want to cling on to power, and they have always seen that London and holding on to London's purse strings is the true power. But if you have devolved institutions, that then makes a case for, let's say, a different voting system, mainly one called democratic representation or proportional representation, as it's called. So this is a nice opinion piece, and I think it sums up what we were talking about devolution. So this comes from The Guardian. And the rest of the country suffers so long as Westminster holds the purse strings. For those of us who've always longed for British politics to shift its focus beyond Westminster, last Tuesday afternoon brought a tantalising glimpse of an alternative reality. A gathering of a press and politicians just outside Manchester's Bridgewater Hall produced one moment of solid gold drama, when the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, suddenly released confirmation that his region would soon fall under Tier 3 of the government's COVID-19 restrictions via a message on a mobile phone and a pronouncement of the decision as brutal. But even without that jaw-dropping incident, the occasion was full of symbolism and the sense of things that had long been kept on the political margins, suddenly bursting into the foreground. Manchester is a city which has witnessed a great many stirring episodes, especially of a political character, wrote Emily Pankhurst in 1914. Here was another example of its talent for the kind of moments that we speak to unanswerable truths. Next to Burnham stood the Deputy Mayor and leader of Manchester City Council, Richard Lees, the holder of the late role since 1996, and whatever the controversies that swirl around the latter-day reinvention of the place that he serves, someone who has led a miracle of regeneration and economic success. Not for the first time, he and his colleagues were on the receiving end of a grim treatment from ministers in London with none of their expertise or knowledge. And the same story flared up through the new Labour years, turning utterly toxic with the arrival of austerity. And since the spring, it has pretty much decided much of England's experience of the pandemic. But this time, elements of the media and politics who usually fixate on Westminster were suddenly listening. It would be nice to think that some observers got a sense of the subtleties that Birmingham, Leeds, and a score of other regional and local leaders have to navigate on a daily, or in times like these, hourly basis. People who ought to be carefully listened to, repeatedly, find themselves being lectured to by non-entities, something pitifully encapsulated in a report from the Manchester Evening News' Jennifer Williams about council leaders logging on to Microsoft Teams call with local government secretary Robert Jerrick and finding themselves that they could not unmute themselves. There remains an overwhelming sense that policy on the COVID restrictions and economic health is being landed on places at a moment's notice. Sooner or later, this kind of condensation had to be challenged. And it is entirely fitting that Manchester has led the charge. The very British malaise that this story highlights, which is almost certainly manifested in England, although all four countries in the UK have over-powerful administrative centres and weak local governments, goes back more than a century, to a diminishing of civil leadership by national government that began in the early 1900s, and reached an absolute peak in the Thatcher era, with a sustained assault on city and local government and the idyllic absolution of England's metropolitan city councils. During the coalition years, George Osborne's creation of the so-called Metro Mayors was presented as an act of rebalancing. When the 2015 Conservative Party conference was held in Manchester, he drew attention to the city's town hall as a great civic cathedral, where the decisions affecting the city would be taken and not remit to a committee in London. But the powers that held by a new crop of regional leaders were far too limited, and besides the idea of great civic rebirth across England, was always rendered unconvincing by Osborne's catastrophic spending cuts, a policy that did not only lead to savaging of local services that is still ongoing, but in forcing Westminster's priorities on councils, they wanted no part of them. They represented a direct attack on democracy and accountability. So it was that many of these places, destined to experience the worst of the pandemic, were denied the means to cope. As the government flails around, it is telling that politics is haunted by the contrasting example set by Germany, where regional and local politicians have a level of authority that the average minister here would think terrifying. Consider, for example, the South German town of Rosenheim, I think that's how you say it, which has a population of around 65,000 and was one of the virus's early German hotspots. To quote the country's health minister, as the authorities there got to work, there were no real instructions from Berlin. Decisions were made locally on the spot, and this is the very opposite approach taken here. A difference reflected in the fact that the UK's death rate is around 6 times higher than Germany's. But the question is, will anyone learn? The government now wants to shake up the British state, but in a way that will leave its chronic power imbalances unchanged. Dominic Cummings' quest to upturn the civil service has received a lot of attention, but it masks the intention to guard and centralise power as jealously as ever. Over the summer, ministers floated plans to abolish district councils in England and increase the number of elected mayors, but they were vague and contradictory and have been ever since postponed. Whatever the outward pouring, the current administration's basic instincts are exemplified by very real proposals to strip councils of planning powers and the recent Tory noises about ending their responsibility for social care. Last week, moreover, brought the news that unless the London Mayor Sadiq Khan accepts a larger congestion zoning charge increase and increase the council tax and fare rises, the government is minded to seize control of Transport for London. Proof of the fact that the politics of centralised banditry damages the capital just as much as anywhere else. And there is little alternative to all this dysfunction. But the Conservative Party, led by Boris Johnson, will never go near it. Labour also has a long-standing centralising instincts that was always made conversations about redistributing power far too difficult, when the outliers of a different system actually seem pretty straightforward. Mayors and councillors need decent tax raising and borrowing powers, a whole range of responsibilities over health and social care, education, housing and transport, and these ought to be spread across regional, city and local government, not on the basis of the current model of ad hoc deals, but a uniform shifting of power and resources with the benefits system and so-called welfare to work now colliding with rising unemployment. Most of these things overseen by the Department of Work and Pensions should be pushed in the same direction. On the matters of national emergency or strategic importance, politicians at the centre should always bring in leaders from the outside, and decision makers from all sides need to embrace one key matter of consensusness: that austerity will never again be visited on local councils. Last week, my Manchester-based colleague, Josh Hindley, offered some advice to national media. If you want to know what's going on here, to be really plugged in, then you have to be here. As a basic guide to action, that might as well apply to just about every aspect of how we run things, right up to the top of government. Such is the key lesson of the first phrase of the crisis, that power and responsibility have to be radically relocated before our age of failure and rupture finally breaks the system for good. And I 100% agree. And not only does this work in Germany, I think France has a very much similar system, how it works. I think most of Europe really does. And this is something that we really need to embrace. But the reason why the Tories don't want to do this is because they like to guard power jealousy. How else? I mean, you've only got to look at the situation currently in Scotland. Their local regional parliament, Holyrood, is currently pretty much dominated by the SNP. Now, imagine if you had a Tory-led government, but you had the SNP in Scotland, you had pretty much Labour in Manchester, probably Northumbria, Yorkshire, probably dominate the Midlands as well, pretty much dominate most of these regional countries. The Tories would be shockingly exposed to a massive loss of power that they just can't influence anymore. And of course, as was said there, regional planning, things like that. So you wouldn't get, as we've just seen, the current housing minister pretty much offered like 50 grand to his mate to start a building project. You know, that would not happen if we had such a devolved system. And I think that's something that, again, we need to push for. But again, I'm pretty much adamant that we also still need to push for proportional representation of a voting system. And I think that starts with transforming the House of Lords into a proportional representative system. I think that's where we need to start. I think that's where the first hammer blow needs to come. But obviously the examples that, as Andrew Burnham has been leading the way in saying, look what's going on in this area, that has been amazing. Now, what's going to happen there? We've seen, of course, Dan Jarvis also repeat, again, Labour-led, mayor of the Sheffield City region, led in that way, but again, needs to be a one Yorkshire deal, not just piecemealed out. So, thanks for watching. As always, please do hit that like and share button. It does help out the channel massively. Oh, Alexa again. And obviously, please, if you are new, but if you are new, do hit the subscribe button. Sorry, Alexa's really thrown me for a loop there. Down below there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link should you like to support the channel, and thank you to all those people that do support me in that way. And sorry, Alexa's really thrown me for a loop. But anyway, thank you for watching, and we'll see you all next time.